Over the last 10 years or so, the pace and intensity of global warming has been increasing, including a spate of extreme weather events around the world. Now, at the same time, Australia has been laying the infrastructure for coal and gas export, which would render it one of the world's largest carbon producers. What happened to the greatest moral challenge of our generation?
In 2010, you described your own direct action policy as a recipe for fiscal recklessness on a grand scale. That's the policy of your own coalition.
That's not quite true. What I said was...
Well, that is true, what you said.
I know exactly what I said, and
He's right.
What I said was...
Our next questioner, Catherine Waldron.
Recently, Professor Garnett described the opposition's direct action plan for climate change as delusional, yet recent polls indicated decreased support for the ETS. Is this a direct result of the outcome at Copenhagen, or do you believe that Mr Abbott's spin of the great big new tax is beginning to resonate with voters?
Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, look, sadly, my views on the ETS are different to my friend Tony Abbott's. I think that Australia needs to take effective action to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. I think the most effective way to do that is through a market-based mechanism, such as an emissions trading scheme. I think the legislation that has gone through the House of Representatives, which really had its origins in the Howard government, came out of the Shergold Report that John Howard commissioned, and we started legislating for an ETS when we were in government, and of course the legislation reflects the agreement to make amendments that the coalition reached with the government late last year. I think that ETS will, if it ever comes into law, be an effective means of enabling Australia to efficiently and effectively cut its greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, I do prefer that approach. I said all that out in a speech in the House, and it made me very sad to have to cross the floor and vote in a different manner to the rest of my colleagues in the Liberal Party. So I was very sorry to do that.
You're quite tough on your own party's policy, and indeed Professor Garner, who was just mentioned there, said the new Liberals' policy was delusional because it was like old communist-style central planning. Was he right about that?
Well, look, Ross Garnaut can express himself in his own language.
Could I use your language to express
well, you can use my language.
Unlike the prescriptive command and control approaches, an ETS leaves it to the producers and consumers.
I think that's actually a quote from the Productivity Commission, actually, which I was quoting. But, look, there is no question that if you want to have a cost-effective way of cutting our greenhouse gas emissions, it should be done through a market mechanism where you set a cap on emissions. You say, right, we're going to have... That's the limit. People have to acquire permits. This is, when I say people, I mean the 1,000 biggest polluters have to acquire permits. The price of those permits is determined by supply and demand, naturally, and that's the price on carbon. And that drives a whole range of adjustments through the economy. Energy efficiency, shifting to lower emission forms of energy, moving from coal to gas and from fossil fuels to wind, etc. All of those changes happen, and they happen efficiently through the mechanism of the market. Now, on the other hand, if you think you can actually achieve that result by having a bunch of bureaucrats and politicians in Canberra picking winners, then I'm afraid to say, as a free market person, as a liberal, as someone who believes in free enterprise, I disagree. And that approach, the market-based approach of an emissions trading scheme, was, as I said, the policy that we, the Liberal Party in government, took to the 2007 election. But my party, the Liberal Party, changed the policy following the change of leadership on the 1st of December. I disagree with that change in policy, but unlike the Labor Party, of which Tanya, of course, is a member, in the Liberal Party we respect individual members' rights to express different views and indeed to cross the floor.
Okay, now before we go to the rest of the panel, we have a question in the audience, and it sort of follows on from what you were just saying, so I'm going to go straight to Michael Chen.
Good evening, panel. Is the Liberal Party abandoning its core principles by favouring a direct action plan over that's administered by the government over a market-based mechanism like the ETS?
Well, look, as I said, Michael, in the speech I gave in the House, I think a market-based mechanism which relies on the free market and principles of free enterprise is certainly more consistent with the principles of a free enterprise party like the Liberal Party than governments trying to, cherry-pick projects. They may do so with the best will in the world, but, the reality is you are better off having the government. I mean, this is my view of politics, right? I'm a free enterprise guy. I think the government should set the rules, set the framework, and then let the people in the market make their own decisions and make their own adjustments. And that's why an emissions trading scheme was preferred by us when we were in government, and the Labor Party basically took up the same approach.
Malcolm Turnbull, one more question for you, and it's really to sort of follow up on what Michael Chen is asking, because in your speech you talked about the direct action style approach of picking winners, etc., which is the approach of the current opposition, as being a slippery slope that can only result in higher taxes.
Well, the reality is this, that if you are going to put a price on carbon, actually, let me go back one step. The cheapest way to generate electricity is to burn brown coal in Australia. That is by far the most carbon intensive. Produces, for example, 4 or 5 times as much CO2 as you get from burning gas, let alone from renewables. So if you want to move to a lower emission economy, there is going to be a cost. Now, the approach that is in the ETS is for the cost to be paid by the polluters who have to buy the permits. And I don't use the term polluter in a pejorative sense, by the companies that are emitting the carbon. But just let me hang on. And that price...
I don't want you to repeat the entire speech.
But that price... that price is then passed on in higher energy prices, right? And that then flows through the economy. Now, we were very upfront about that when we were in government. You've got to have a price. Now, if there is not going to be any price paid by the polluters, and if there is not going to be higher energy prices, then the only way it can be funded is out of general revenues, which means, naturally, taxes, higher taxes. You can't, there is no such thing as a free, carbon-free lunch.
OK, so just very briefly, and to put it simply, the new opposition's policy inevitably, if followed through, would lead to higher taxes.
Well, if you wanted to achieve very substantial emissions by the government spending the money, the government buying the abatement itself, then that can only be funded out of tax revenues. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have higher taxes, because you could cut services somewhere else.
Right.
So
you could not cut emissions.
Well, or that's right. Or you may not cut it. Well, you may be right. You may end up spending more public money in terms of taxpayers' money and not effectively cut emissions. My view is the market-based mechanism, the emissions trading scheme, is the most cost-effective.